All right, then let's resume. This will be our last roundtable. It's been a very busy day. And here we have a roundtable that's seized of a very important matter. At the end of the day, we'll be looking into the matter of the intellectual crisis and the future of our universities and the press. Obviously, this links into what we've already talked about yesterday and this morning. And so, launch this conversation, or moderate it at least, we have Madame Simon-Nahum, who's a professor of philosophy at the Ecole Normale Supérieure and works at the CRNRS, National Research Institute. And she's brought out a book linked in with the themes we've been looking at over the last 2 days, Les Déraisons modernes, which is advocacy for getting things back on an even keel. Have a good debate. Here we have 3 speakers. And we also have a speaker coming to us direct from the US. So thanks to one and all, and have a lovely debate. Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you very much for your attendance. I know we're competing with the lovely sun outside, but we're going to endeavor to keep you inside the tent. Thanks very much, Laura, for giving me the honor of joining this 2-day event. This is our last roundtable. So I'd like to take this opportunity to pay my thanks to Jean-Guillaume de Tocqueville, thank his wife and his children, because I really think that here is a wonderful forum for debate and sharing. So, as you said, Laura, we are now in the eye of the storm, right at the heart of the phenomenon that you're talking about. The destiny of democracy is going to happen now. The future of universities in relation to society, and the narrative that we'll forge for living together or for driving a wedge between ourselves. So here we want to talk about education and transmission. We need to talk about the role of the media and thinking about the cross-generational transmission through schooling and universities. Because we're not talking only about the circulation of knowledge per se, a little contrary to what was said this morning. We need to know about knowledge. Knowledge has been built, conceived of, but it needs to correspond to its own language. But it's not communication per se that creates dialogue and discussion. So this throws up a central question, the question that was central to Tocqueville's thinking. In other words, how can we shape citizens in a democracy? Now, concerns are here today. It's nothing new. The destruction of democracy from within by growing and spreading elements that run counter to the democratic spirit, by undermining the fundamentals of humanist knowledge. Universities, the media, are they the locus of building totalitarianism, a new moral order? So here we're kind of seeing what brings us together is delegitimizing the elites and the way that knowledge is built, as well as its content. Now, I'm not sure that handing on knowledge should be done on an egalitarian platform. It's not possible, and it's not even desirable in my view. So what prejudice flows from battling against the cognitive framework that we have? What's our responsibility in that dynamic? You'll remember, the third part of the revolution, Tocqueville describes how in the mid of the 18th century, man of letters, became the leading political figures, and what was the consequence of that? And he offers two reasons. First, the love of abstraction, and the second, he said, and I think this is really what applies today, is the way that each ideology becomes a philosophy. Now, I'm going to say that with this round table, I want to be able to provide an answer to Tocqueville by showing how much ideas and dialogues that we're going to have on this rostrum do have a potency to exit us in the right way from this intellectual crisis that we're grappling with. So let me provide an introduction of the speakers very briefly. You know one of them at least very well. Of course, I'm talking about Yascha Mounk, who is an associate professor at Johns Hopkins University in international relations. Next to me, Rokhaya Diallo. He is well known, particularly with the French, because she defends her ideas on television sets and media. Rokhaya is a journalist. She is a writer, a film director, but it's also a researcher at the Gender, Place, Justice Initiative research unit from the University of Georgetown.
We're also have a video call, I believe, with Arthur Milikh, who is the director of the Claremont Institute Center for the American Way of Life. Greetings, sir, and I'm sorry that you were not able to join us here in person, but we're very pleased to have you via the platform. And finally, we have Jean-François Bronstein, who's a philosopher. He teaches at Sorbonne University Paris 1. And a few years ago, he took a little sidestep in terms of his specialty, which is a history of science and epistemology. And he penned a book, and it has a bit of a provocative title, Philosophy Gone Crazy, Gender, Animals, Death. La philosophie devenue folle, le genre, l'animal, la mort. So now, without further ado, I would like to start this discussion. And I would like to ask you what you think about the positioning of knowledge in the media and in universities. And here I really refer to the philosophical dimension. What is being taught? What is being transmitted? And how is this being done? So I don't know who wishes to start. Rokhaya, would you like to? This is Rokhaya. Yes, I will start then. I'll try to be brief. Good afternoon. Thank you very much to everybody who has made this event possible, and who thank you for hosting us. I've had many informal discussions and pleasant discussions with many attendants here, and so thank you for giving us this opportunity. And I will try to provide a response to your question relating to the place of knowledge. And I would like to go back to the whole issue of social media that was mentioned at the previous roundtable. Today, access to knowledge has become more accessible. It's become globalized, more democratic, and this knowledge is not necessarily moderated through the filter of traditional transmission of knowledge. But in terms of the media, I also get the impression that the circulation of knowledge is also the circulation of experiences, because in terms of the person's experience who is conveying knowledge will have an impact on how the knowledge is conveyed. And so some minority experiences may be more visible, and media are perhaps encouraged to bring up issues that were not brought up in the past sufficiently. And for example, earlier we talked about how social media may have had a lot of negative effects, but I think that they also gave voice to the voiceless. They also helped conduct revolutions, political revolutions, such as the Arab Springs, and also social revolutions, the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter. And thanks to social media, some people who were perhaps living in isolation were able to talk about their experiences of isolation and oppression, and to have these have a certain resonance within our societies. Thus, in terms of societal issues, that particular form of knowledge that is experience-based knowledge and that is not necessary part of the elite sphere of knowledge, the fact that these people have access to new areas of expression uh, made it necessary to take into consideration certain stories, certain narratives that in the past had been filtered out by a single way of looking at them. Because I believe that sometimes the people who are tasked with conveying knowledge often believe to a very limited number of social categories. So it wasn't always easy for everybody to have access to knowledge and to share their own knowledge and their own culture in the larger sense, or their experience, which were not always viewed as legitimate cultures and knowledge. So I think it's actually very positive what's happened in the past few years. So it wasn't always easy for everybody to have access to knowledge and to share their own knowledge and their own culture in the larger sense, or their experience, which were not always viewed as legitimate. I concur with many of those points. I believe that social media enabled many people to articulate thoughts, and it also has compelled the mainstream media and society to understand the experience of these people. And I concur with many of those points. I believe that social media enabled many people to articulate thoughts, and it also has compelled the mainstream media and society to understand the experience of these people. And I'm quite skeptical myself about any attempts to try to control that which is said on social media. Because of course it is always those who have power who control who can speak. And the notion that this would be a liberating influence, I believe it's a liberating influence, particularly at a time when there's a lot of authoritarian governments taking people from front and center. India to social media, even in the United States at some point. So I do think it's important. It's a bit naive, rather, that people on the left or people from the elite think that you can control that. That's what's said on social media, and that this could have a liberating effect. And I say it's naive for many reasons that have already been expressed by Rokhaya. That said, I do have a certain amount of some concerns regarding what's happening with knowledge in universities and in the media right now. If I look to the U.S. media, there's been a complete diversion of the audience. 20 or 30 years ago, the New York Times still played the role of being a newspaper of record. So perhaps a bit more left leaning than right leaning, but many members of society, most members of society, could refer to this newspaper as a reservoir of facts and of realities. However, this type of newspaper or newspaper of record no longer lives in the exists in the United States. So there are a lot of media institutions that people from the left believe are telling the truth, and there are a lot of media that people from the right believe are speaking the truth, but there is no media that people from the left and right think they can rely upon and that they can trust that media. So we no longer have a shared reality, none whatsoever. That's empirical. We can see that in polls. In addition to that, there's another issue. Many of the standards that were important in the past in mainstream media no longer exist. And of course, none of us can ever be completely objective, but we do endeavor to try to write reality in an objective manner. And this is less and less true, even in large U.S. Media groups. So there's a lot of propaganda, counter propaganda, but there's no space that can be used as a basis for public discourse and discussion. And this is a major issue for our societies. And this is what leads to people not believing in vaccines, not believing in the reality of elections, not believing in the most basic of truths uttered by their co citizens. So if America is more polarized today than it has been for decades. I think that's largely due to that. Now, if we look at the world of academia at universities, it's all a bit different. There's no polarization, but rather there's a unique culture that's emerging. There's a certain range of viewpoints in major universities. I don't share the same opinions of all of my colleagues, certainly. Nonetheless, it's apparent that the number of professors in major universities who say they're liberal, that is to say left-leaning, is 30 or 40 times higher than conservative professors. So it's a bit of a monoculture. And this is also visible in specific knowledge areas. For example, we did a meta-analysis on discrimination against women, which of course exists. But in this meta study, what should have appeared, there were studies that have a specific form of discrimination and those that don't think there's a specific form of discrimination. So there should be about the same number of studies, of statistical observations. But that's not the case. What it was is like a type of funnel vision. So studies that contained very few observations still noted that there's a lot of discrimination. And the studies that had a lot of observations were more likely to conclude that there was no discrimination. What does this mean? Well, if you conduct a study on a very specific field, so I'm talking about a very specific field, and if you do say there's discrimination, then that means that this article will be published. However, if the results of the outcome of this study means that there's no discrimination, then it won't be published. For it to be published, you need to have 10 or 15 times more observations, which is very difficult to obtain. So that's just one example. There's certain areas in academia that have such a large consensus that anything that goes against that narrative is very difficult to publish. And it's very difficult for people who have counter narratives to find work and to find positions within universities. And so if you look at the United States right now, uh, in the media, there are two completely opposite realities that don't create a common sphere for discussion. And in the university world, increasingly, there's a very homogeneous ideology, which may appear more sympathetic than the other side, but this may lead to many misrepresentations and fallacies concerning reality simply because everybody's in agreement. Thank you, Arthur. Milikh, would you like to jump in at this point?
I hope you guys can hear me well. Thank you so much for having me here. Just one quick word. Tocqueville has been my lifelong companion. So it's a great honor to be here. And for the Tocqueville family, I hope you know what he and his writings have meant to so many people. Just a couple of contrarian words to what has already been said. Universities didn't always exist in all societies. And in our societies and modern liberal democracy, their point was to replace the aristocratic and clerical class as the safeguards, as the keepers of the books and the tradition of wisdom. And I know that today it's very easy to say that because of social media, because of the internet, there is a great deal of dissemination of knowledge. Well, in a way, that's true. There's a dissemination of information. But I'm not so sure that there's a dissemination of knowledge. If you think through what it actually means to study the greatest and most difficult books of the Western tradition, I'm thinking of Aristotle or Tocqueville himself or Shakespeare. You can't just do those things on your own. You need to have teachers that have done those things for their whole lives to show you how to read those things, to teach you to think through those immensely difficult questions. For example, in Aristotle's metaphysics of being, nobody can just approach that. And so when we have this prejudice that there's more knowledge now than ever, what it actually ends up meaning is that we think that we're more intelligent than generations of the past, and we actually abandon the very difficult, trying work of thinking through the really hard questions with the help of the best teachers. And therefore it disposes us because we flatter ourselves that so much knowledge is so simply, easily available in a tweet, that we don't have to do that hard work, and we're more disposed to being propagandized. Our minds actually become less nuanced, less capable of deep penetrating thought, and more engaged with the active titillating passions of anger, vengeance, whatever other passion is the flavor of on the menu. One last comment on the press. Tocqueville makes this amazing observation in volume 1, where he says that the promise of the freedom of the press is that there will be more and more freedom of the mind. But he says that actually, in practice, the opposite is the case. Because human minds are so weak and frail and depend on traditions, depend on authorities, the freedom of the press creates such a chaos of opinions, such a cacophony, that the mind cannot find its own way, and therefore it just finds a camp where it can attach itself to, and then it rests there and just repeats whatever that camp says. It's an amazing observation, which I think is truer and truer today. Obviously, Tocqueville is a friend of the freedom of the press. He thinks it's absolutely necessary for liberal democracy, but he sees huge problems that regrettably, I think we are less and less inclined to admit to.
Thank you.
Bien, merci.
Jean-François.
Jean-François, the floor is yours. First of all, I'd like to thank the Tocqueville family, as well as Laure from the Figaro magazine, because these conversations have been incredible. And this is exactly what is no longer possible in universities. The conversations that we had yesterday and today, I don't think we could have these in the spheres of my university, for example. So I'd like to thank the Tocqueville for this. What is a university? It's academic freedom. It's the free exchange of ideas. Stuart Mill said this, and many others after him. And academic freedom is constitutionally a full-fledged part of our work. And today, that is no longer guaranteed. There are no longer exchanges. You talked about the book I wrote. Well, there was a petition that was written by colleagues who accused me of many different things. And I'm not an isolated case. And so the university world is in very poor shape. Secondly, universities are tasked with conveying the knowledge of humanity. And from this standpoint, well, the situation is perhaps not as dire in France as it is in the United States. But when you see professors, eminent professors, who say that they're going to be shutting down classical studies departments, Latin and Greek, because it's very manly and white. Well, you know, for example, there's a colleague during her first year of Paris 1, started a course on Plato and said Plato is a white philosopher. All right, what's the problem? What's the issue here? So, yes, the transmission of culture is problematic. And there are many works that we can no longer read at universities. And literature teachers know that they can't talk about certain books that are viewed as controversial today. And so this is second point that I just mentioned is up for discussion. So thirdly, what is a university? It's striving towards an effort to strive towards objectivity and truth. It means that our work aims to set up proposals that are demonstratable, verifiable. And this is where there's been a huge leap in terms of quality. The wokes, to use the name that's been given to them, and of course, it's not the bad old Americans who are invading us, and this was not invented by French. And so people say, yes, the wokes, you invented them or we invented them. That's very arrogant. That's hubris. We didn't invent anything at all. And in fact, most woke theorists, with the exception of Butler, most of them are not readers of Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze. They were often inspired by others. So that's not what's the issue. But let's just call them the wokes. And yes, they have invented something that's not spoken about much, but it is starting to emerge in conversations. and they've discovered new epistemologies, plural, philosophies, new sciences, notably, and this is, I think, was the theoretical crux, and that's the epistemology of the standpoint epistemology, the idea that there can be no science unless it's from the standpoint of a white person, an old person, an Asian person, and so it was quite clever on the part of Sandra Harding. She says, yes, it's a very strong objectivity. And everybody says, oh, strong objectivity, that can only be good. But strong objectivity means that everything's relative to your viewpoint. And I believe that this is a staunch attack against sciences and against truth. Now, here's another example in the area of gender. Many colleagues, philosophers, mainly and sociologists, may say that biology says that there are two genders. And so they're going to say biology is virilist, patriarchal, and it needs to be changed. But that's simply not possible. This is an insurrection against science and against truth and against reality. And so, unfortunately, this may seem surreal, but this is what happens to me day in, day out with colleagues at La Sorbonne who have to explain that the body is a social construct. No, our bodies exist. And what's even more paradoxical, if we look at Foucault, apparently Foucault is saying that the body is a construct. Foucault wrote Naissance de la clinique, Birth of the Clinic, which talks about the body's black stone and says that anatomy exists, the body exists, it's complicated. Foucault's not happy with this. He wishes he could change bodies, but it exists. And so this brings us to things which, in my opinion, are attacks. And perhaps we'll talk about whether the situation here is better or worse than in the United States. I'm not sure yet. Yascha apparently is saying that there's not a lot of diversity in American universities. In any event, this is very serious because this is an assault against the notion of truth and against the notion of reality.
Je pense que le fait qu'on soit
I think that the fact that all of us, particularly the students, are constantly on the net, playing with computers, as Christopher Lash said, that which mentioned earlier, is this also that leads to sort of gnosis, a forgetting of your body? You think that's just on your screen. No, we have bodies. Bodies are existing. And in there also we have different classes, of course. George Mitchell said it in an article in the Figaro recently, people who are behind the screen who could work remote working. And the others are real life, the reality, death, reality. Matthew Crawford, also at the Philosophers that I quite like, said the same thing. You have to understand that reality exists. And today we are within this debate. I think there's a debate that is fundamental because it's the basis itself of knowledge that is concerned. So perhaps before getting to the solution, because I think on the observation, I don't want to start polemics that can be developed here. But what is interesting to me is to move forward towards the solutions, perhaps a word on genealogy of the phenomenon and the way that it seems to me, in any case, is different in France than what it is in the United States. And this is where I will go back to what George Mitchell said yesterday, that is his model, his theological model, is not quite the same value for France or for America. So perhaps Yascha and then Rokhaya, what do we fear from the US? What comes at home? What would be the differences in between this model of identity politics, to put it as it is, in between the mode of teaching and the conception of knowledge in France and of the difference between France and the United States? I believe that I'm going to repeat what I just said yesterday. According to me, it's difficult to define this movement of those ideas because they apply to various themes and therefore have various positions in various debates. However, I think they're linked to a certain way of thinking, the heart of the society. It's a kind of struggle between various identity groups in which each identity group has a register of oppressors, a register of oppressed, and very often in the debates, the solution doesn't come from I think our society, whether it's United States or France, that made universal promises, and a lot of times they excluded a lot of people because of their identity. I don't think we should rejoice about this universal freedom. So we have to change our society so that everybody could participate and be part of this universal freedom. But those different speeches have rejected this idea, saying that it's unrealistic, it's just formalism, universalism or liberalism. There's always a fake that are hiding their real strength reports. And in fact, you have to reverse hierarchy that we had before. So the best that we can hope is that these were their privilege replaced the oppressors. The oppressed replaced the oppressors. And this is why I think that this thought doesn't bring us to societies that I do hope the majority of us want to achieve. So now, in the United States, it's very present in the society right now. It went beyond university. For a long time, Americans were saying, it's just in campus. It's just students or 20 years old were a little bit crazy, or 20-year-old always had crazy ideas. I'm sure it's the case in France too. So don't worry too much. However, during the last 5 years, it went from university to media, to private funds, even to major companies, and now is dominating American culture, mainstream, or the elite culture in any case. In France, I have the feeling that it dominates maybe not in universities in the same way, but it's very present, I'm sure, in universities as well, or in part of media. And the question is then, is that going to happen to conquer the rest of the society in the same manner that what happened in the US? And I have to say that I'm not too sure about the answer, but as I was saying yesterday, you have two possible models. The first is European culture during this last 60 years was more or less US plus 5 years. What happened here was more or less what happened in America 5 years before. Therefore, it's going to start today. Now, you have another way of thinking, which is that the strength of this in the US has a lot to do, in particularly with the specific story of the United States, but also with a culture that is Protestant, perhaps even Puritan, a culture that always had witch hunting as a mode. You see this in McCarthyism and so forth, in the 18th century in literature. Republican and Catholic as French culture perhaps is another mythology for managing the issue of people who sinned, or how to behave, which are the cultural processes that allow the atmosphere in the US are not native to France. So it's going to be different here. I have to say that I'm not deciding in between the two narratives. Perhaps it's going to mix into both. I think it's too early to know that or to decide for sure. Okay, we'll try and have the question. Doug, Rokhaya, well, we hear a lot about woke since yesterday. So it's going to terrify a lot of people, but it's a way of designating a group without having their borderline. I have the feeling that most people that are here, are sitting here, are very privileged and are not in position of risking, or we are all privileged, let's face it, face not face a risk that is not so important to lose whatever. So there is a fear that I believe is disproportionate. But there is an emergence of minority speech, that people who indeed didn't have access to certain clubs that were locked up by elites and question things that were considered as evidence. Yesterday is enriched a narrative that was reserved to some people who had a power, and the power actually, to accept or refuse some speech in their space. So when we talk about conquest, it's a vocabulary of war, it's a vocabulary of offensive. And who says conquest says power? I think that it's important so to wonder about the reality of the power who people who are there. It's important to have different ideas from ours. So I'm happy that we talk about these issues earlier about social classes. It's a key question when we talk about reality. The realities that are going through France are diverse. We're a country who knew different social issues. I talk about the yellow vest, for instance, which is the emergence in social and mediatic space of a France who couldn't speak before, who was did not recognize himself in a mediatic or majority speech, and it emerged very surprisingly for the people who didn't know that this France exists and were asking basic questions. How am I going to end the end of the month? How am I going to feed my family? Those are important issues. And I think the collective knowledge is also rich from the experiences that are different from others. When we talked about the questions of gender, that we don't necessarily strictly to associate to the issue of sex in the genital, is because we think of the gender as a social experiment. I think the expression of gender are different. Some culture consider that the expression of gender should be binary, but other cultures in the world have known the expression of gender that were very diverse and sometimes with a form of fluidity, which doesn't question the body, but in a social certain space, you can express or recognize each other in a gender that is not necessarily linked with genital organs, and it's something that we can discuss without fear of erasing the body. And then, of course, it's a name that is laudable and legitimate. You want to be objective, of course, and it's important to try to do so, but you cannot do so negating the body who is producing knowledge information. With social bodies were structured by social experiments that prevent us from seeing, in any case, or perceive society from standpoints that are not ours. That's something that we cannot understand because we don't experiment them within our flesh. If I have a pain somewhere, you can understand I have a pain, but you wouldn't share my pain. So when you're continuously perceived of such and such a manner, we can only, for instance, let me take an example that is very specific. Endometriosis, for instance, that is a disease that concerns many women. Knowledge about the awareness about this is a fact of women, and the medical world for a long time ignored this disease that is affecting a lot of women, and we needed ladies, particularly privileged and activists, of course, who gave Imani, for instance, or Nora Malacré, but this question was ignored because the people who were experiencing this pain didn't have enough power to acknowledge the medical urgency that was concerning them. And we can apply this malady to trypanocytosis that is also affecting certain part of the population that is not visible by the elite scope. So this is what I had to say. So I would have a lot of things to oppose, but I have to pass the floor to Arthur Millie, who I'm sure wants to answer.
Very quick. I think that speaking specifically to the question, I think everybody has a sense of the diagnosis of what has happened and what's wrong. And I'm sure I regrettably missed the whole conference. I'm sure other people have already diagnosed it. What's more interesting, I think, in a way, is to ask what this morality, what this ideology leads to. And I think that that is the least discussed. And I think that some of the people that propagate it are a bit confused about it too. They haven't thought it through. I think that the best purveyor of this, the clearest and most bold summary is Ibram Kendi. It's very clear. He basically says the following, that the marginalized are intellectually and morally superior to their oppressors in a fundamental way. They are morally superior because, as he says, it is a gift to have been marginalized insofar as it allows him to understand what justice is. In other words, he has moral purity in a way that the oppressor group can never have. And it means that there's intellectual superiority, because while the oppressor group can never understand the experiences of the marginalized, the marginalized, on the other hand, can look through all of the so-called superstructures of the oppressor group. They can understand cisgenderism. They can understand American constitutionalism as rooted in white supremacy, whereas the oppressors cannot understand those things. And so what this ends up meaning is, of course, for universities, all of the old books, they don't matter. But that's the least interesting point, actually. The more interesting one is that this ideology means that the marginalized have a moral and intellectual claim that is unfalsifiable to rule, especially in universities, which is a place that supports this kind of ideology. And so what it ends up meaning is the word, the polite word diversity means as few oppressors as possible in any given good sphere of life, and hopefully one day zero. That is one of the goals. For the purpose of what? Well, Kendi kind of gets at this. For the purpose of establishing the self-respect of the marginalized, which is a big problem, because if these issues were discussed openly and in a serious way, if it was permissible to do so in American campuses, then you would see that what is called self-respect actually ends up meaning the need to persuade the oppressor group that the reason that I respect myself is true, and to get the oppressor to agree and say yes. That is regrettably, that's a kind of psychology that is a very dangerous one and that leads to a great deal of unhappiness. But it also has practical consequences. Nobody has mentioned this, but I think it's worth reflecting on. That same ideology is currently in the process of being imposed onto university science departments, onto physics departments, onto chemistry departments, onto biology departments, with a view basically to establishing hiring quota. Whatever you may think of this, whether you think it's just or not, put that question aside for a moment. What this will lead to, if this continues to expand, is the destruction of competence in the universities, the destruction of real physicists who do it and love it and who are the most capable of doing it. And you may say, well, what does that matter if justice is achieved? It doesn't. Well, there are consequences, and the consequences are basically this, that as a liberal democracy, we are in competition with the world. And other adversary nations, like China, for example, they are seriously cultivating the sciences. And in modernity, national competition ends up depending on technology and science. And so if we lose that comparative advantage against other nations who are doing everything, I have China in mind, who are doing everything in their power to cultivate the best and the brightest and to get them into the sciences, and who are creating quantum leaps, quantum advantages in various technologies like quantum computing. And if we lose in that because of this gamble that we're taking on identity politics, the consequences to the nation will be, I mean, they're obvious and they'll be enormous.
Thank you. Jean-François?
Oui.
Thank you very much, Jean-François. I completely agree with what Milikh just said. In other words, if it exists in human sciences and social universities, so what? Not important. The issue is that it's also in the Department of Math and Science, and in France also. But in the US, it was beautifully exposed by Claremont, who said that he left Romania because of Ceausescu, and now he was prevented from doing math because they're racist and sexist, saying that Chinese understood this type of thing, that they're recruiting the best mathematicians and so forth, because they're going to be able to work peacefully in China. Now, about France and the US, taking back what we're saying, Yascha, we are in the same page. We're all in a campus. It's there in companies, in the opera, what have you. The issue that I believe is the observation has been, the diagnosis has been done. What is fascinating for me is the cause. How a teacher of Latin, who spent all his life of Latin, decided to close his department. How a biologist can say men have their rules, women have penises. No, men have their period and women have penises. It's absurd. And of course, it's a world of illusion in which we're living. And this is, I believe that the religious expectation is quite judicious, and we do see exaltation, enthusiasm of a lot of students or young colleagues for this. It's perhaps more interesting to see this rather than doing differential equation. I'm not sure. When you're tired, then you change topic. But I'm very astonished by this, and I would say that in United States, I had read your book, and I saw that the drop of Protestantism during the 20s was going from 50 to 20%. So perhaps it's a replacement of Protestantism. I don't know what's happening in France, but I think we talked a lot about it during those days. There is a lack of sense. Why? What is the sense of my studies? One can find a job that pays a lot after literary study. And of course, there is also guilt, probably, that is not the Christian sense, but guilt of Shoah, of colonization, and so forth. And there's something there that is quite interesting. And to wrap up, I said that what is fascinating to me particularly is that there is something that we really stress, is that the first religion that was born in university, it's the first religion that was born in university in history of man. The problem is that normally university helped us to criticize from the point of reason or enlightenment. We criticize religion. Here we're in an extremely complex situation, and I'm delighted to be able to talk about it because this is the first university religion in story. So what are we going to do is very complicated. I have 2 or 3 proposals, but it's a situation, in my opinion, that has never heard before. Correct me if I'm wrong, but normally Christianity, for instance, where people from the low classes, here it's the first time that university specialists are inventing a religion. I don't know how we're going to get out of it. Yascha?
Revenir à la
All right, let's just return to the origins of this conversation. What are the similarities and differences between discourse in France and the States? Because I think I've changed my view on this, or at least improved upon it over the last half an hour, possibly over these last 2 days. It's my feeling that the battle lines are pretty similar, but you get the impression it's the same debate, but the battlefield is different. So I find myself in a strange position here on this rostrum because we're talking about substantive things, but I don't know, Rokhaya, whether you are in agreement with me. I think I agree with you. But when you talk about what can we say about the States, or what's the American language on this? Is there a problem in America? I think we are fundamentally in disagreement. Why? Well, it's because the battlefield is different. Here's an example about gender. I would agree with you when you say that there is a biological gender, but then there are different forms of expression of gender. And I think, in a society, we need to show respect to that, and we need to free up people who express their gender differently, to shelter them from discrimination. But I would agree with Arthur when he says that in the States today, there are lots of areas where in universities, when you can't talk about physical gender, there are professors who talk about biological gender in medical circles where it's important. but they get shouted down, and they say, like, I'm not going to do that anymore because I maybe lose my job. Or you might talk about, what's the risk of doing certain things? Or is it just something that may affect the privileged? Me as a journalist, I spoke with a chap who's an electrician in San Diego, a chap who has a Latin American family, so he's a minority in the official Latino categories in the United States. But this electrician is apolitical, he's never voted, he's not interested in politics. And he put his hand outside the car, and just like this, negligently, he put his hand like that. And there are people to laugh. They were saying that that symbol means okay, but in fact, it's a symbol of white supremacy, they said. And some people started using that symbol as a white supremacist sign. And so the chap was photographed, therefore, with that sign that he was doing just quite by happenstance. There was a Twitter scandal that developed. In the next 5 days, he lost his job. It was an electrician, didn't care about politics. He himself is part of a ethnic minority. And I can tell you, what we're seeing in the United States is not just a problem where people have privileges and maybe, I don't know, they want to challenge other people's privileges. But it affects real people, your man in the street. And that ideology is not an ideology of the poor, of the lower classes who are in rebellion against elites. No, it's an ideology of the elites, the American elites are deploying and imposing upon the rest of the society. All right, let's make some progress in our debate here. Let's move on to the solutions. One of the proposals that I'd like to put before you is to try and think about language. And a word, Rokhaya, that you've used a lot, experience. Of course, we cannot experience what others experience. It's called empathy in philosophical terms. But not to be able to put yourself in other person's shoes doesn't mean that that I'm closed to their experience. And second, it doesn't stop me talking about that, doesn't stop me being interested or talking about that. And philosophy is all about that, entering into contact with the other, developing a critical mind to extract myself out of myself with a view to experience and share my knowledge of the world with others. And, beyond that, to the benefit of mankind. So I would be slightly, well, in fact, deeply in disagreement with what you said about the risk that we're all running. Possibly as the privileged, we're not risking any immediate social risk. But, when you look at in the university environment where you've got scholars who can no longer work, if you will, when the language that's used in the media, in university circles, or more broadly in society. So you say, for example, look, here is an identity for you, and you must tell me where you're speaking from. And in France, you're absolutely right. I mean, it doesn't only come from the wokes. This is what Pierre Bourdieu was saying. Tell me where you're speaking from. But I can be a number of identities, and I can subvert my identities from within. And I can also speak from an external perspective. So one of the proposals I'd like to lay before all four of you is to see whether we can't return a little bit, backtrack a little bit, looking at the concepts that we're handling here. And then we obviously leapt into the heart of the matter by talking about domination with lived experience and about the body experience. But after all, are we not talking about words and concepts that we all must try and get beyond, to say things differently, to put things differently? And I would say to establish a new vocabulary, a new lexicon that would deal with a new democratic project, whereby though what's going on now, this intellectual war that's being waged, is a threat to democracy. Because it's doing that, I feel threatened. I feel threatened. I feel threatened through all the identities that are mine, but first and foremost, that of a citizen and that of a philosopher. So, right, this is what I'm placing before you. Can we detach ourselves from this corseted ideology, this single mode of thought, domination, the body, experience, with a view to thinking about a relationship differently? Do you think that's possible or not? Well, first of all, let's just go back to what you said at the beginning of your intervention. You said that the fact that you didn't experience something shouldn't stop you talking about it or associate yourself with it. At no point in time in my intervention, I said that it wasn't possible or even to commit for the other. What I was saying was that understanding of some subjects was diminished or limited by your own personal experience, because there are things that you just don't understand. An example of yellow vests, I think it's pretty striking. Nobody saw them appear on the horizon, quite simply because, we today, what is it, the 19th of September? I can't remember what day we are now, but on the 18th of September, there are people at this time don't have money to finish their month of September and to eat. And these are tangible issues that are not our own. But, it wouldn't even occur to us today. We don't ask ourselves that kind of question. No, well, not in the same way. What I'm saying is that problematic we didn't see emerge because people who are offering information don't experience what experienced the yellow vests. So it's not audible. And now, through the yellow vest, we heard something that could never be heard before because we didn't experience it through our bodies. Now, I'm not a yellow vest. But I think I've got a lot of things to learn by listening, by taking initiative to speak with people who are not the same as me. Sorry, I don't want to stoke. Sorry, I almost finished. I do apologize. No, finish. Sorry. Jean-François then will respond. I just want to be courteous with each other on the rostrum. So anyway, I think many of us defended this particular position since the beginning of this two-day event. So I think we need to listen. Even matters that irk you somewhat and that challenge your views and that may shake up your certainties, which I've done a lot since yesterday. So, I think, the exercise would do some good. Anyway, let's talk about university. Quite honestly, everybody here will, obviously, as a social risk in university for people who are scholars and academics, but it's very low, that risk, I think. When you talk about university, I think in terms of likelihood, how likely is it that the children of workmen can get to university? In France, the way that university studies are structured is such that people who have a high social capital know scholastic strategies to get around, to circumvent university, and the horizon is open for them. But when you look at the social cultural profile, economic profile of people who are making research, it's worth remembering that the people who come from troubled areas in society are very few in number in the university. So how can we get parity, equality? People who are able to produce knowledge from all strata of society. We are a country, after all, with our watchword: freedom, fraternity, etc. So that involves what? It means mobilizing the elites to open up, and their establishments to open up to other experience, other life experiences, which means you're challenged by people who will be formulating questions in a rather uncustomary fashion and take you out of your comfortable, subduely lit couches. And I think from an intellectual perspective, you need to grapple with that. All right, I don't think intellectuals are in those lounges. Yes, but from the statistics show that from a social perspective, yes, but social origin, I think that's another debate altogether. It's important to remember. No, we don't want to monopolize things here. No, but I think this is very interesting. Progress has been made. Work on the history of gender, women, and what have you. That's of interest and of value. And you need to take into consideration women's knowledge and traditional women's knowledge. Fine. But when you say that in order to know something, you need to have experienced it in your flesh. Well, sorry, that's why I wanted to butt in, really. It's because it makes me too much think of something that French know very well, Morin, who said that a Jew can never understand Racine because he's not French. Overlapping speakers. No, to be honest with you, I'm not there to be compared with Maurras. I think that's defamatory, actually. I think it's defamatory. Yes, but as a Jew, that's... Yeah, but are you realizing what you're saying? It's serious what you've just said. Well, what's serious about it? It's extremist. You know, there's no... It's night and day what you're saying. There has no... No, hang on a sec. We don't want to challenge you personally. Well, I take it as such. No, but it's not. That's not what's going on. Jean-François is saying, I think, and which is also mine, really, the idea that you can know something without having experienced it or having had... this is all about literature, isn't it? Can you read? That's fiction. Yes, but it's fiction. Yes, but it's about... can you write a novel, let's say, about the islands, I don't know, in Tahiti, without ever having gone there? Well, yeah, I expect you could. But yeah, no, but I'm sorry. Here you're talking about imaginary fictional works. What I'm talking about is reality, social movements, and people who who experience exclusion. Yes, but Hengel's... No, but I'm talking about bourgeois as well. I mean, emancipation. Feminism, for example, in most cases, it's produced by women. Well, Yascha, look, I just like to say that obviously this is becoming a bit bloody on the stage here, but for me, there are two ways of looking at this epistemological question. First, basically, is to say, look, quite obviously, there are experiences that you don't have personally. All right, and there are very significant things that you cannot conceive if you haven't experienced it, because it's what is to experience, say, sexual harassment as a white man, in the United States, let's say, to be frightened of the police if you're a white male, if they stop you and they frisk you, and you're stopped a number of times for an identity check. So I understand that, and I agree. There's a significant point here. You need to talk with your fellow citizens to see what their experience is, because there are some experiences, in all likelihood, I cannot access. And and I recognize that, and I acknowledge that, and I think that's very important. But in the United States today, and here again, I think the battle lines are slightly different, but anyway, sorry, the battlefield. But in the United States, there is a way now of talking about epistemology that goes well beyond this. It's not just a member of a particular group has probably had different experiences. No, but they'll add 2 or 3 additional layers to that by saying, first, look, that experience gives wisdom, a political knowledge that is greater than the members belonging to other groups. But that's a bit problematic, because it could be true both ways. The member of privileged groups also have a knowledge of what pressure is, because they've acceded to certain positions that that other people don't have. So our Marxist position would be different, wouldn't it? It's because you're excluded from power that you don't have that knowledge. Anyway, it's a bit difficult from a philosophical perspective, but beyond that, there's another thing that you could say by saying that, look, there's something more virtuous with oppressed groups. And so you just need to make sure that they have the political power. So if we want justice, and if you're a member of the privileged camp, you have to say, look, I'm going to do what a less privileged group is going to want me to do. I'm not going to think as an elite about my own knowledge objects. I'm going to philosophically, because I'm an oppressor group, in order to restore justice, I'm going to give a platform to the less privileged group who will tell me what I have to do. Problem about that, of course, is that the vast majority of people are just not interested or even able to rule, in inverted commas. And people who want to have social justice, they'll say, well, I have to decide who is a genuine representative of that oppressed group. There'll be lots of members of that underprivileged group that won't agree with each other. Now, if I'm in agreement with him, you could say, well, you need to be the representative of the group. But another will say something else. And so what's the effect of that? Well, it is that there's a massive social conflict, but without having anything come from it. So what does it mean then? A way of looking at epistemology, a different model to what we see in politics today. It's to say, let's say, that I must listen to my fellow citizens' experience. You need to understand that if a member of another group, a less privileged group than mine, possibly, they'll have experiences that I don't have. And so I really need to listen to their experience. What did they go through? But I do believe that I can understand what they tell me and that I can make my own judgment in respect of what I hear. And if somebody is suffering from sexual harassment or police harassment, well, it's because of my own values, my own ideas about what society want to build, and therefore I'll fight to destroy that injustice. But in the United States, that's not the point of view of the militants that are on the ground today. Arthur Milikh?
Just to add a couple of points. One is that I'm not sure how much courage is actually needed to say these kinds of things, because the whole regime, all of America's major institutions support all of these positions and exist to promote them. I mean, it's like the same courage of putting a gay flag out your window in San Francisco. It requires no courage. You're just signaling to the regime that protects you that you support it. So that's number one. It takes courage actually to be a dissident because the powers are so disproportionate. I want to add one other thing about lived experience. If one takes that as their standard, that means that the past is completely closed. All of the past is utterly obliterated. You cannot understand the Greeks through Homer. You cannot understand the Romans through Virgil. That ends up being nonsense. And it's not nonsense. There's a great deal of wisdom there. One last point is that I mean, as Yascha just said, I think nicely, actually, there are some experiences that should be listened to and respected, and other experiences that should be ignored, and to whom one should have a regard of humiliation and hatred towards, namely the oppressor group. One should hate them. Their lived experiences don't matter. Lived experiences are only applied to the marginalized. But the key to this is that one can never ask questions. One can never ask questions of those lived experiences. One can never say, well, maybe you're confused about your lived experiences. Maybe you've mythologized some of the lived experiences. That is verboten. That is punishable by social death in America. And so what you end up having is perspectives, lived perspectives of marginalized groups that are holy, that cannot be touched, that cannot be thought through, that cannot be thought about. And the regard with which they should be treated is you simply listen. And somebody mentioned empathy. Empathy here is just a one-way street. You empathize, you listen, you accept whatever it is that is being told, and then you, the oppressor group, needs to be quiet because you fundamentally cannot understand those lived experiences, and your lived experiences don't matter.
Thank you. Rokhaya, je pense qu'on a...
Rokhaya, we've heard your standpoint, but I would like to come back to a question that I think is essential in order to open ourselves towards solutions and in order to make progress. What I'm struck about in the manner in which things are presented today is that they refers to a philosophical discussion that's already taken place. When Max Weber distinguishes between explanation and understanding, these are things that philosophers and historians have repeatedly worked on. So in your opinion, what is the specificity of the current expression, And how might it remove itself from the realm of delegitimization? Together, how can we build a way of thinking, a science that meets certain standards of scientific objectivity that will enable conversations such as Habermas defined it? We need to agree upon on how we're going to have discussions and dialogue. Otherwise, we won't ever speak to one another. So, in your opinion, how can we make progress? How can we come out of this crisis? Which for historians of philosophy is not something that's completely new. Well, listening to each other and not throwing anathema at each other, and not locking certain forms of speech into prisons of speech, into straitjackets. I think it's we need to listen to people who in the past didn't have access to speech, and to maybe listen to their knowledge that's been developed from other standpoints. And this is not a willingness to delegitimize, it's just calling into question, but it doesn't call into question the legitimacy of the people who are expressing themselves. You mentioned the issue of empathy. The idea is not to forbid anybody from speaking out or from supporting different viewpoints. As I said initially, I don't believe that anybody here has anything to lose by expressing themselves. Maybe they'll be slightly uncomfortable because they'll have to listen to things that are not necessarily pleasant to hear. But I don't think anybody here is risking very much. Most of the people here are in rather enviable positions. And I'm not sure how to express what I'm trying to say, but not exposing oneself to contradictory speech, that's a luxury that certain people don't have. And I'm referring to people who are continuously exposed to the knowledge of people who are in a position of social comfort. And that's also what's happening. So I believe that there's a bit of an exaggeration in terms of what's happening, that something that's going on is very serious. I've heard a lot of warlike language. When I started speaking, I felt that there's a lot of tension, whereas I'm the only person that's saying something that wasn't said before me. So we need to realize what's happening and look at the rapport de force. I mean, let's be realistic. It's not in favor of what I'm defending. I think what's at stake here, here you're talking about things on a social, you're placing them in the social dimension. I would like, no, but I'm talking about the intellectual level. You explain that we are offended by discordant voices. No, that's not the case. Philosophy is all about having discussions with people who are not in agreement with you. But I would like to be able to continue teaching Aristotle to my students. I would like to continue teaching Plato. And I believe that Plato develops a type of thinking that is perhaps more interesting than current thinkers. But I'm told that I need to teach those thinkers because they are discordant voices. The problem is that we're in an absolute form of relativism, and this is all about updating the current. But how can we exit this? Do you recognize that there are certain works that are superior to others, that some authors are more interesting than others, and that perhaps they don't refer to the social reality of the moment? I mean, Plato, but that's even arguable. But that these authors are important to study in order to understand what's going on around us. And so making these works available to those who are voiceless and who are in certain social situations that are not as advantageous as ours, that it's all the more important to make those works available to them. But I'm not saying that you shouldn't teach Plato. I'm not saying that it's banned. Well, I think it's I think that it's pretty amazing that somebody in the audience yelled out at me, Messi, yes, I hear people whose voices are raised against me when I speak. I think it's unbelievable what's going on here on this stage. Well, there are many interesting statements that are being made. Standpoint theory, well, in terms of primatology, Donna Haraway explains that the fact that women are interested in the lives of chimpanzees has moved science forward. But we need to go even further than that. We can't simply remain locked into certain viewpoints. In terms of the social standpoint, perhaps we should have more specific studies, but it seems to me, based on what my students say, that is those who are most privileged, who are the wokes. It is elected officials, it's the white elite that make up the wokes. And therefore, I'm not really sure who is feeling most challenged today. Is it a student who wants to write a thesis on de Bonald, a reactionary writer? This student's not going to find a job afterwards, and he's not going to find a thesis director. Whereas trendy topics are perhaps easier to support. But this all has consequences. What are we going to do about the legacy of humanity, given that it's largely biased? It is a lot of white men, but not only. And so it's good. We are rediscovering women. But there's a petition of philosophers that's saying that they wanted to have exactly the same number of female and male philosophers are studied. But what about the antiquity? Plato, Aristotle, and there's Hipparchia and Empathy. There are two very interesting philosophers, but just a few lines that have been written about them. So what do we do with that? So in order to reestablish a balance, are we going to distort history? That's the question. But of course, the issue you raise are very significant, and I think we need to be able to talk about them calmly. Yascha, do you want to say something? And then afterwards, we'll pass the mic to Arthur. Well, I can't really comment on who should be allowed to teach what in France and whether or not the fears of people are legitimate. I can only talk about the United States. And there are two things that really have shocked me in the United States. First of all, personally, I know about 5 or 6 people who have been dismissed from the work for ideological reasons. And they're not reactionary individuals. They're not far right or right wing people. But these are individuals who have lost their positions because they did not want to buy into a certain fashionable consensus, or because they criticized certain positions. And so I believe that these people are perhaps more woke than anything that's been said here today. And so I think I take this very seriously. And so I know a lot of people who are very concerned, who are feared that they may lose their position based on what they say. And this brings me to my second point. If somebody's if you teach in a university today, so you can say, let's not talk about this out loud. Let's not talk about this here. Let's go somewhere else. You hear that in today's universities. My students tell me, well, there's no political, you can't have a political discussion with students because you don't know who's going to post something on social media about what you've said. Maybe I have a best friend that I can bring up these issues with, but generally speaking, I don't have political decisions with my discussions with my fellow students. And that's really shocking if that's the social atmosphere in today's universities. And this is something that's felt day in and day out in the United States. So I can't comment on what's happening in France. I haven't had that impression over the past 2 days at the lovely Chateau de Tocqueville. I don't know if this is representative of how debates occur in France. But in the United States, that's a true risk. When I came to the United States, that was not the situation. And it's just happened within the last 5 years. It happened very quickly. And so I don't know if this is going to happen in France, and I don't know if it's already currently happening in France, but I'm very concerned that it could happen here as well. And it's a state of affairs that I find absolutely shocking. Arthur Milikh, would you like to jump in?
Sure. It's important to just for a second look at, where people think this is all going. And my view is, at least in America, the kind of identitarian side of the political divide, which, as I've mentioned, controls To some degree, not completely, but to a great degree, the universities, the press, big tech, the finance world, all sorts of immensely powerful institutions, they have the hope, I think, at least some of them, that this worldview can be successfully imposed onto America, which is why it's always pedal to the metal. It's always more and more quickly, with more force. And they think that that method will succeed and that somehow all of America will be won over. And they haven't fully thought through, I think, or maybe some have, but they haven't fully thought through what exactly do you need to do to actually fully impose that doctrine? And the answer is either A, tyranny, or B, there will be a great deal of resistance. There's already a great deal of resistance. I mean, you walk around in certain places in America, there's almost a revolutionary spirit in the air that is being provoked. And it's very unstable and it's very unhealthy. And I don't think that 50% of Americans will just say, yeah, okay, we ascribe to this doctrine. I mean, they're creating a powder keg, which may at some point be explosive, very regrettably. And I say this very regrettably because I'm an immigrant to America. I was born in Russia. And I love America, and I don't want to see that happen at all. And I think that there are ways to calm things down that may be available to us, which I suppose we'll talk about in the next session. But just to answer the question directly, I can't speak for France, but in America, there is one readily available cause for unity, which is some kind of patriotism and some belief in the legitimacy and the constitutionality of America. In other words, I don't mean a bunch of lawyers explaining to us what the Constitution really means. I don't mean that. What I mean is some understanding of a broad swath of Americans that we are a legitimately ruled country, we are a legally ruled country, that it disperses justice to people who deserve it and punish those who don't. Only under that heading can the stability of America keep going forth, in my opinion.
Thank you. Peut-être alors pour...
Thank you. So perhaps to conclude before we pass the mic to the audience, and there are many hands that are raised already, but perhaps one last question for our panelists in order to look at the connection between the university, the media, and the future of democracy. So in your opinion, how can we, well, apparently it's not universities that are necessarily going to save democracy, but can external democratic changes perhaps save universities? Jean-François, what do you think about that? Well, I'm not really sure, but to go back to what Yascha says, I often hear the same stories. Students come up to me when the room is empty. They say, I'd like to come and talk to you. But I said, you're by yourself. He's like, no, we can meet up 2 or 3 people outside of the university. I said, this is Orwellian. And yes, the situation in France is quite similar and quite dire. So perhaps France will be able to withstand this better because of our Republican ideals and our universalist ideals. However, but Macron has 2 ways of speaking. He has a universalist speech and also a speech that attacks white males. But in terms of France, regarding universities, these are institutions that are highly centralized. Either they will prevail or they will collapse. It's not like in the United States where you have very different types of universities. Here in France, all universities function under the same model. And the situation is serious because there are 100,000 searchers, teachers in universities. I tried to count the number of those who had committed to a petition or to an observatory, and there may be 300 tops. And why is that? Well, many people say, oh, those are just old people, they're retired. But I have young colleagues who say, I don't want to have to bear the weight during 20 or 30 years of having a social death. And I've lost a lot of friends. What are we at risk? I've lost friends simply because I wrote a book. And so I think we need to have the courage to try to react And I'm not going to try to use the gay, wrap myself in the gay flag, but there's a very beautiful text about somebody who says countries unite. But, inclusive writing, nobody in universities doesn't use that. Everybody uses inclusive writing. That means you accept this doctrine and this dogma, and we need to try to resist at times, but it's very complicated. And of course, it's not something we're accustomed to doing. And that's why earlier I was a bit frustrated, because for me, it calls into question the very definition of what universities are, of what anti-racism is, of what science is. And so I'm not sure whether the situation is going to change, or rather, I don't know how the situation is going to evolve. I don't think that academics are going to decide in any event. I believe that the nation can determine what's going to happen, but I don't know what the future holds. But I tend to have a more pessimistic point of view. Yascha or Rokhaya, would either of you like to interject? Well, since everybody's telling stories, I'm going to tell a little story too. When we talk about what you might lose and who's allowed to say what, I was appointed to a commission called the Digital Council, and we had been mandated because the government wanted this digital committee to be comprised, because what I say, because I talk about state racism. So when you talk about who's got to lose something and who's exposed to vexation, well, my resignation was demanded by the French government, and I never heard the same reactions to the fact that you're allowed to say things or not. And what I say costs me a lot. So if we reduce ourselves to anecdotes, they'll just remain as anecdotes. But I don't belong to any. The fact that there was something against somebody who doesn't belong to the political party, I'm a journalist, and the fact that I said something, there's a decree that had been published. In fact, for me to be able to join that institution, well, we all have stories to tell, and my story, it's documented. Just Google my name and digital commission. This is documented, and this is that was commented in international media. So what I think is that we need to also look at those type of things.
Des gens, enfin, à l'instant, vous avez...
Now, right away, you said that people that you consider as woke, you have the feeling that they belong to privileged spheres. The discussion that we had on popular violence came from popular districts, people who are in unprivileged neighborhood, not really visited by people in France. But this analysis comes from people who are coming also from fringe of France that are not very visible. This social issue is not only social, it's also intellectual. The thought is a production of knowledge from traditional references. It's also nurturing this knowledge from multiple references. And I feel that it's not a question of erasing Plato, but perhaps to question, also to ask the question of how the curses were built in virtue of what's rational, and perhaps authorize yourself to step aside and to sidestep, and to, you talked about the opera of Paris earlier. I don't know what happened, it's fantastic. So today you're reinterpreting creation of Chevalier of St. George. It's not a loss for the opera for me, it's the fact of putting back on the stage a person who disappeared, that however from his time was very popular and was a black man, and for me it's enriching the repertory. Yes, but I believe it's good for rehabilitation as composer, but not necessarily because he was black. Yeah, but perhaps he disappeared because he was black. Possible. You need both. This is what I always said. You have to listen to me and not have fantasy about what I'm saying. I would love to, the battle line would be the same in the United States. Seeing this, I believe that the both sides are reasonable from what I see in the United States. As far as I'm concerned, the issue was how to find a solution. Well, there's not a solution. It's going to be very tough because this mechanism of social polarization is very deep. But I know that myself, as someone who is acting intellectually and politically in society, I'm trying to maintain my own principle. I believe in liberal democracy. I believe in certain universal principles. I recognize that there's a lot of people that historically were not recognized within the framework of this universal principle, and that should be changed. Therefore, I redefine my position. What should I do in society, and how should I reach this? For instance, myself, in this small competition of anecdotes on stage, the answer is very clear. I don't know all those cases, but it's not acceptable that the French government are kicking you out because what you wrote, but it's also unacceptable that my friends in the United States lost their jobs because of criticism. The answer of all this is not to say there's a problem, that there's no problem, is to have the principle of freedom of speech, not only legal, but create a culture in which all of us have confidence to discuss on these themes, because the themes that we mentioned today, race, gender, class, are very complex, and the answers are not clear. However, we're going to find knowledge and truth on these themes, and we're going to resolve proper problems in our society if we can have an honest conversation on that. And this is not possible. Either it's black and if it's black and white, and we are each trying to erase other standpoints. So as far as I'm concerned, the important is to fight for your own principles and for the principle that I do hope that we all have in common, such as free speech, which allow this debate to roll on. Thank you very much. Dr. Milikh, do you want to conclude?
Well, I suppose I'll conclude with just a policy suggestion that's only my opinion, but in America, there are something like 3,500 colleges and universities. That's a great number. And I don't see why that number is necessary. I know that many of those universities, their existence is artificially propped up basically by limitless subsidized federal loans and cash transfers from the federal government or state government to those universities. In 1970, in America, something like 20% of the college-age population attended college, and now it's 40. And there are huge costs to that, namely that we have a huge labor shortage in America of working class jobs, of skilled labor. What I would like is for states to start creating apprenticeship programs like those that exist in Germany that are, I think, very well run, so as to start training young people, not putting them into enormous debt by going into college, and giving them professions that they can, become happy in. Add to that, I think that states should start taking away money from their state universities. These are lavish, decadent places that sustain innumerable useless administrators, that sustain all sorts of things that I think harm the country. And states have the power to withdraw that kind of money. I'm very much for the freedom of speech. I'm very much actually for all of these interesting marginalized perspectives. I just think that it's absolutely not necessary for taxpayers to subsidize ideologies that are harming the sciences and that teach pretty openly that citizenship in America is a disgusting thing, that one can't be attached to one's country because it's fundamentally evil. We have the freedom of speech. You can teach those things, you can speak those things without question, but it doesn't mean that it should be subsidized by state or federal governments.
Okay, thank you very much. Donc, il est 5h.
So it's now 5:10. We have 20 minutes for Q&A in the room, and I see there's a lot, so 20 minutes, sorry. We have to stop promptly at 5:30. Maybe Uriel, because Uriel should have been part of the panel, and perhaps he can have the floor first. Thank you. Uriel Epstein.
Donc, des questions courtes.
So short questions, please. I'm not shy, of course. Thank you very much. And thank you to Yascha for agreeing to take my place. I agree completely with Yascha. Interpretation.
With respect to universities, and I've certainly personally experienced what Yascha describes in my own work with universities. But one of the things that I think we did not discuss on this panel, which is about the rise of different ideologies and conflicting intellectual ideologies, is the issue of identity politics on the right, which I certainly cannot speak, particularly to France, but I do feel comfortable commenting on the US. Arthur earlier noted that that what might you be able to unite the country is the constitutionality of America, and that we are a legally ruled country. And yet, just a few months ago, of course, you had a significant contingent of America, approximately, I think over now, 75% of the Republican Party, that refused to accept the results of a free and fair election. Now, this, of course, goes fundamentally against the very concept of a legally ruled country, of a constitutional country. And the question of, well, there were questions about the election. The fact was that there were over 60 lawsuits, none of which succeeded. And despite that, there still remains a very significant percentage of Americans who believe that the election was false and who are now using that as a tactic moving forward. The other note that I would make on this is that since 2015, there were 265 right-wing extremist plots or attacks and 91 fatalities, while at the same time, there were 66 attacks and plots on the far left, leading to 19 fatalities. So my question here is, to what extent are these two, shall we say, identity-based politics influencing one another, and what is the nature of the right-wing version of identity politics?
Thank you. Yascha, maybe?
Yeah, let me respond to that in English. I think that's absolutely right, and it's one of the reasons why it's so important where we insist on principle rather than letting this just become a sort of engine of polarization. A lot of who is able to cancel you depends on the nature of the institutions you're in. Now, in the United States today, a lot of the facially neutral institutions that once were open to people from both sides, have effectively been captured by the left. That is true of the big universities, of the foundations, of the legacy media outlets, and so on. But there are, of course, very important institutions which are essentially right-wing institutions. And in those, there is often as little tolerance for disagreement over a variety of issues as there is on the left. And so certainly if you are working today in a conservative think tank and you're very outspoken about the fact that Joe Biden legitimately was elected the president of the United States a little less than a year ago, you may well lose your job. And so the answer here is not to say, my anecdote versus your anecdote. The answer is to say, we want a society in which we have strong institutions in which people can speak the truth without fearing for their job. And we need a public sphere, which is not just composed of the left-wing media that always stays within its narrative and the right-wing media that stays within its, in America, often more pernicious narrative, but rather media outlets that actually are real locus of debate for different citizens to engage with each other in good faith argument over what reality is and where we want the country to go. And that sadly is abundant in its absence today in the United States.
Jean-François?
Juste deux mots pour dire pour les amis.
A few words to say for American friends that this is not the same issue in France, and all people who are sharing my point of view are coming from the left, which I would call Republican in France, of course. Another question? Sir, you raised your hand, and then you, sir, and then ma'am.
You want to, because I don't see you very often, so if you want to speak, just tell us.
while I've been highly critical of Rokhaya, of identity politics, I actually want to side with Rokhaya to some extent here. My thesis of identity politics is that its central trope is the voiceless, innocent one. And I actually think that's a worthwhile trope. But I think the question before us is how do we, once we decide it's a worthwhile trope, what do we do with it? Martin Luther King famously said, after the integration of University of Alabama, the reason we want to go to school is because we want to study Shakespeare too. That's a very different view than the left of identity politics now, which is we don't want to study Shakespeare because he's one of the guilty parties. And my suggestion, and here I agree with Arthur, look, let's leave aside the noise of the last few years. The American Republic has lasted a long time. We went through a civil war. The great question is whether the Constitution and the mores of the country allow us to deal with ever and greater inclusion and franchise. And what I am troubled by is that the left has refused to believe that we can actually do this within the framework that we have. And here I think I'm siding with Yascha on this. We can actually do this. But the idea that to get equity and justice, we have to overthrow the constitutional order, that's where you lose me. But I'm agreeing with you that the trope is important.
Could you repeat which trope?
The voiceless, innocent victim. That is an important trope. And I think a liberal regime should always pay attention and listen. But a liberal regime is not a suicide pact. To listen should not entail the destruction of the liberal regime. This is why I use the Martin Luther King Shakespeare example. It cannot be, to be inclusive, henceforth, we have to not teach Plato anymore. It cannot be the case.
Merci pour votre...
Thank you very much for your intervention. I absolutely agree with you. As I was saying earlier, let's not erase what was considered today as common culture, of course, but on the contrary, to open up and to allow other perspective and point of view to exist. For instance, if we talk about literature in France, we have a traditional and classical literature very abundant, but also some coming from the new stories from France. The specificity that we have in France versus the United States is that we are the only country that is over 4 continents, i.e. we also have culturally a very wealth that should be commonly known. And this is why I think that we should gather to share this very classical culture, but also allow to everybody to know what makes the specificity of France and not only the central metropole that, but what constitutes the territory outside of European side. That is really another topic where the battlefield is actually different in the States. We're not trying to add up different actors in America. But why should we read these authors or listen to them? We've done this for a long time. Let's put a stop to it. Different battlefields. 2 other quick questions because we have 5 minutes left.
Thank you very much for this interesting talk. What I'm wondering, or what strikes me in the narrative of this, or in some narratives of this discussion, is that it sounds like today there are more voices being oppressed than ever before. Or it sounds like in the last decades, there haven't been people who couldn't raise their voice. So very simple example, I guess during the Cold War, a professor writing about how good communism is at a university lost some friends, maybe lost his job. Or a professor who outed himself as being homosexual also lost some friends or lost some jobs. So what I'm trying to say is, and let me make this clear, every canceling is bad, but it's not like there's only canceling happening now and it's the worst thing happening ever. And since this is a Congress where liberal ideas are being held very high, shouldn't the question, instead of looking at who's canceling whom, be how can we create an environment in the future where less canceling overall is happening? If we admit that canceling and cancel culture has been the case for the past decades.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think that certainly when you think of homosexuality in the United States, we've made wonderful progress. That, you know, when you think of somebody like Ellen DeGeneres losing her talk show on television in the 90s because she came out as lesbian, there was certainly a form of cancel culture, and it was utterly terrible, and it's a much juster world for the fact that that doesn't happen anymore. But I also like that people sometimes bring this up as a way of saying, oh, you see, so it's just normal, and why worry about it? That's precisely why we worry about it. We have learned from the past that there are these moments of witch hunts in which people are treated really unfairly and unjustly. And it's not just the damage to them. When Ellen DeGeneres was cancelled, it wasn't just an injustice to Ellen, it was that too. It was an injustice to all of the other gay people, for example, or lesbian people in the country who thought, well, hang on a second, if I come out and I'm honest about who I am, this is going to have terrible consequences for me, so I better shut up about this, right? It always has a ripple effect that goes well beyond the society. You know, my grandparents were good Orthodox communists, so you know, I have some family standing to say that a lot of the people who are cancelled by McCarthyism deserve to be cancelled. They were terrible, terrible Stalinists who in the 50s were coming to the defense of Stalin. The problem was not that what they said was wrong. The problem is that cancellation itself is wrong, but it's wrong to create a blacklist because you disagree with somebody's political views, not because they had political views that I want to defend, but because that is a terrible way to run a society. And so, yes, there have been witch hunts like this throughout history at various points. We're at the height of one now. It is much more intense today than it was 15 years ago or 10 years ago in the United States. That to me is quite clear. It's not stronger than it was in the 50s or in certain other time periods, but that's all the more reason to stand up against it courageously, because I think in retrospect, it'll seem quite odd how few people had the will to stand up against something that in my mind is quite evidently unjust.
Thank you. Two more questions. Manuel.
Two other questions, ma'am, and then sir.
Thank you. My question is directed to Mr. Milikh. I don't know if he's still with us, but
I hope so.
Okay. He was referring to quotas, and he said that quotas are a destruction of competence. And my question is mainly regarding this statement, because I always wonder, why is it whenever quotas are mentioned, it's assumed that the marginalized individual that's being selected to join this quota will just be plucked randomly out of the street, not from a group of individuals who are qualified to be applying to a certain position or a certain university among other qualified applicants. So why is it always assumed that this marginalized group will be less competent, even though in reality it's almost always the case that they are equally competent, however they are not chosen because of their identity? And then my second question...
No, only one. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Arthur, maybe you can respond?
Yes, I'd be happy to. It's a great question. And I actually don't think that. When you look at the hiring process on many campuses, I have friends in science departments throughout America, and the situation unfolds almost identically each time there's a candidate search. Namely, they evaluate the best candidates in a physics department, and they find that best candidate, and then a dean intervenes and says, no, that can't be the candidate. It has to be another candidate that will fill a quota. I don't at all actually mean to say that those kinds of hires can't be excellent hires. I'm critical of the process as it takes place on many campuses that I see evidence of over and over again.
Thank you. Une dernière question?
Another question? No, it's not a question, but a quotation from Camus, who's one of my masters. The Greeks wondered about what was fair. They can no longer understand our idea of justice. Equity for them involved a limit, whereas our entire continent is looking for justice that they wish to be total and without limits. Shall we leave the last word to Camus? Okay, thanks very much.